Larian Studios' Baldur's Gate 3 has left a long early access period to critical acclaim and massive success, and after playing it, I can understand why. Baldur's Gate 3 digitizes the free-form gameplay of Dungeons & Dragons in a way that keeps the spirit of that tabletop role-playing game intact, which results in some of the most interactive and reactive narrative gameplay that the medium has ever seen. It also is using its own engine technology, which is admirable from a studio in an era where even the largest and most colossal AAA studios are giving up on pursuing their own bespoke tech and instead opting to use Unreal Engine. In today's video, I will talk about the visuals and performance of Baldur's Gate 3 and give you in the audience a good idea of what PC you might need to run this game at optimized settings. Now, before I get into the menu, like how I usually start a video, it is apt to talk about the game and the visuals on display here. For the game, it is Dungeons & Dragons, the tabletop role-playing game in a near pitch-perfect digital form. I last more regularly played D&D more than 10 years ago at this point, yet I was astounded how well Baldur's Gate 3 marries that analog experience with a digital one. So much is done right here between the tone and the mechanical way that the tabletop experience is implemented. Whether that is the overt way the game's master narration sneaks into moments,
the blood in your head thrums and pounds. That pounding blood obscures who you are. An overwhelming loss of memory.
or the way you navigate the environment in encounters, utilizing environmental dressing and player attributes to come out victorious. It's all free form and flows wonderfully, and the amount of choice you have to affect the game in your own way is staggering, and I can really not even put that into words. One of my favorite aspects is how Larian has blended in specific analog things from that tabletop experience where it matters most. In combat, the rules of chance are dealt with automatically in a digital way to keep combat fast and satisfying, as much as is possible in a turn-based system. But when it comes to big moments of play or action, like in the tabletop game, chance is made overt with an analog throw of a d20 die that you can see spinning right in front of you, your fate left up to it. If you have ever played tabletop games, then you know how exhilarating this is, how empowering it is to see a natural 20, and how hilarious it is to see a critical failure. Larian keeping this in is golden, and as I see it, Baldur's Gate 3 is the best translation of that D&D tabletop experience into the digital realm that I've ever played.
My rancid blood whispers to me, kill, kill, and kill again.
From a technical graphical perspective, the game is admittedly, though, nothing special. In many ways, the technicals on display here are similar to what you would see in a last generation PS4 game. There are shadow maps, screen space ambient occlusion, and just enough texture and geometric detail to make convincing facsimiles of all the famous archetypes and objects you can find in D&D lore. The technical makeup is indeed last gen, but the execution is great nonetheless, I would say. Characters look great and animate well, especially in dialogue, which is surprising given the amount of voiceover work in the game here. Special effects from attacks are fanciful and detailed, and yes, the areas you traverse through can be particularly evocative and beautiful. Given how this game is shipping with a Vulkan client, I really would have loved to have seen some of its graphical quality being upped in meaningful ways with that API. For example, the SSAO in the game is just ho-hum. Replacing that indirect shadowing with a ray-traced variant, or even ray-traced global illumination of some sort, would do magical things to the game's presentation. Even something as simple as ray-traced shadows would help the game out a bit, as shadows, even on their highest settings, can be lacking, showing obvious flicker or aliasing. But that's really all I have to say about the graphics. They're good enough, but that really isn't what the game is about. Now, I was just talking about Vulkan before this, and before I get into the menu, I want to talk to you about which API you should use in this game, as the choice for your API happens before you ever get into the game, in the Larian launcher that pops up when you click to play. That is, if the launcher works for you. On my one test PC with the Ryzen 5 3600, this launcher loads quickly and responds well to my inputs. It's not a nuisance. On my much more powerful Core i9-12900K machine, well, the launcher is unresponsive and takes an eternity to do anything. I have no idea idea why, of course, but that is the experience that I have. So if you're in a similar boat as that 12900K, I recommend going to the PC Gaming Wiki and entering the launch parameters that you can find there into Steam or GOG to skip the Larian launcher and go directly into game with the graphics API of your choice. So what is the graphical API of your choice here? DX11 or Vulkan? For NVIDIA hardware, when GPU limited, as in when your GPU utilization is at 99% or above, the DX11 renderer will run around 8% faster in a like-for-like scene as we're seeing here. It's hard to beat NVIDIA's DX11 driver when GPU limited, so it's not a surprise. On AMD, there was no measured advantage to running either API when in a GPU limited scenario, so both showed that same FPS average. So if you're GPU limited on AMD, as we see here, it would appear both APIs are pretty equal. On Intel, with me testing on the Arc A770, Vulkan managed to be an astounding 20% slower when GPU limited versus DX11. This surprised me, as Intel is notorious currently for being better at DX12 and Vulkan than DX11 and lower. When CPU limited, as in when your GPU utilization is below 99%, the story is a bit more complex. In a perfectly static scene, as we saw before, devoid of NPCs, both AMD and NVIDIA will see the Vulkan API running around 22% faster. This makes sense, as the lower level Vulkan API will be most likely bottlenecked by draw calls in such a scene, and Vulkan does these things better than DX11. For Intel, at the lowest possible resolution I could run, the A770 was 29% faster when CPU limited versus DX11 in Vulkan. So all GPU vendors will run the game better in such circumstances under Vulkan when CPU limited. But this performance advantage for Vulkan only applies to scenes with low amounts of NPCs. When you get into a populated town area like I'm showing here, or in a combat, NPC calculations become the most expensive CPU process most likely. And when CPU limited in such NPC driven moments like this run through the town here that we're seeing on screen, as you can see that both Vulkan and DX11 are going to perform much more similarly, with DX11 actually taking a lead in average frame rate, as I found, 3 to 5% depending upon the configuration. In such scenes, both APIs will show a similar level of frame time stability, with small hitches occurring at similar moments as the areas traversed around NPCs, both on NVIDIA and on AMD hardware. It should be noted that AMD hardware in DX11 and Vulkan produce less clean frame times than NVIDIA or Intel under these APIs, with there being large recorded spikes on AMD that were not there on other vendors. For example, I recorded a really large 270 millisecond stutter on AMD while doing this run under Vulkan, which never at all happened on Intel or NVIDIA. But that's the story on NVIDIA and AMD. Intel showed different results in this benchmark, where it actually had an average frame rate lead of 13% for Vulkan when CPU limited. So the situation is, like I said, not so clear cut. As to which API you should use, I recommend most AMD and NVIDIA users use the DX11 API, especially as your CPU becomes more modern. DX11 offers better GPU performance on NVIDIA, and the CPU advantages that Vulkan has do not universally apply to moments where it might matter most, like when there's a lot of NPCs on screen. DX11 also has some other positives working in its favor. Triple buffering actually works in DX11, where it doesn't at all work in Vulkan, instead just having full screen tearing. Similarly, Will Judd at Digital Foundry also experienced multiple Vulkan related crashes while playing the game that he did not get while playing in DX11. So Vulkan is perhaps a bit buggy at the moment. Maybe if you have a very old CPU and you're struggling to attain 60 FPS in even the most mundane moments, then DX11 is perhaps not your choice and Vulkan could be better, but I think for most average users, DX11 is going to be the best all-rounder for stability and bug-free enjoyment on AMD and NVIDIA. If you are an Intel GPU user, the API decision is harder. If you're playing the game in a GPU-limited way at a high resolution, targeting performance of around 60 FPS, then the API of choice I think is going to be DX11. If you're targeting performance of 120 FPS at lower resolutions, then Vulkan is maybe the better choice. Now with that API question out of the way, I can get into the menu and talk about the technical user experience on PC for Baldur's Gate 3. The options in Baldur's Gate 3 are good. Not perfect, but not bad. You have general descriptions of what each option does, as well as usually an accompanying image of the visual change you can expect. This can suffice usually, but I still think there's some room for improvement here. For example, which PC subcomponent is taxed most by each setting would be useful, CPU, GPU, or VRAM. Also, technically the game allows you to change the graphics in real time with no issues as far as I can tell, so perhaps they can make the background menu go transparent for those moments when you actually change a setting so you could see it changing in real time. As for the settings themselves, they are useful, as I will talk about later in the optimized settings section, but there are some key things that are still missing, I would say. I'm grateful to see DLSS and DLAA here, but not every user has an RTX graphics card. The game really should have launched with at least having FSR2 officially in, and preferably using Streamline to get XeSS easily in there for Intel users. Right now you have access to FSR1 if you're not on an RTX GPU, which, as we know, is not really good. If you run it with similar performance to DLSS, you can just see how woefully inadequate its image quality is. It's just dreadful for desktop class components. FSR2 here at least would be a viable alternative, and the game really should have shipped with it at launch as I see it, instead of 1 month after release, as has been announced by Larian. As for that DLSS and DLAA quality, it's good here in Baldur's Gate 3. It uses an older version, but has a lot of positive aspects. I generally think it looks better than the game's TAA at nearly every preset, even at lower resolutions where it offers much less blur in the image. And it also has less ghosting in world elements, such as on these particles here, which are ghosty with TAA on, but with DLAA, or DLSS for that matter, they'll be nice and crisply rendered. There are two DLSS issues though that I noticed. One is that hair in particular can have a little bit of trailing going on behind it when in front of depth of field, giving it an unstable appearance. Another issue occurs with the game's depth of field, and I think it's perhaps a developer oversight. Essentially, the lower your DLSS internal resolution is, the less depth of field is visible because the focal plane is changing. Objects that are closer in the background become clearer the lower the DLSS mode is. This is atypical in DLSS implementations, but it is something to be aware of if you're a fan of the game's more cinematic dialogue sequences. Altogether, I would say the technical user experience in Baldur's Gate 3 is good. The options are adequate, and you even get some nice things like the entire game's UI and camera style changing when you use a mouse or keyboard or a controller. That is some intense dedication to have the game have such a different UI when doing that. Still, I would like to see some improvements, such as DLSS issues being cleared up, and of course, FSR2 being in the game as quickly as possible. Optimized settings in Baldur's Gate are a bit different than it is in other titles. That is because the game is not exactly very heavy in the first place on modern CPUs and GPUs. Maxed out at 1440p with the most expensive option selected on an RTX 2060 Super, a 4-year-old mid-range GPU, the game would typically find itself in the 50s in the overworld, with the worst being seen in those cutscene-laden moments with depth of field driving the FPS down to around 40. All this while the game is using just a bit over 4.5 gigabytes of VRAM really at most. Yes, that's all while maxed out at 1440p while using DX11. So unlike many other modern games ported to the PC, this kind of PC first game has very fair VRAM usage for its generally competent texture quality. You were getting this much performance on an old GPU at 1440p while maxed out, and I think that's actually really great. And activating something like DLSS in quality mode will then just lift that GPU up to a level where it's going to be at a stable 60 FPS pretty much almost anywhere. That's really great in my book. Still, not everyone has a GPU of this caliber, I guess, or access to DLSS since there is no FSR2 here, so optimized settings are definitely called for still. As such, I've gone through the settings to give you a sense in the audience of which ones you can tweak down that offer the best bang for the buck without compromising visual quality. First, starting with fog quality. This option reduces the resolution of the game's volumetric fog, barely showing noticeable differences at high, for example, for a nice 2% performance win in this scene, but it can actually be much higher in others. But as you go down to medium or low, as we can see here, the sharpness of the shadows in that fog noticeably lessen, changing the artistic intent, I would say, in spite of a near 5% better performance at low. Here I recommend high for optimized settings. Next, there's shadow quality. Here going down to medium will affect shadow crispness and resolution, but it offers a substantial uplift in performance, nearly 10% there going down to medium. Going down to low increases performance a little bit more, but starts having obvious issues in shadow aliasing and removes smaller shadows from things like foliage, so it's definitely not worth it. Here I recommend medium shadows for optimized settings. Then comes depth of field. First, you can change the type of depth of field to Gaussian or turning it off, and in my measurements it really only helps by turning it off, but I think that negatively affects artistic intent, so I don't recommend changing it. There's another depth of field option which changes how circular depth of field is filtered, as we see here. Turning the option down to remove the denoising step, as it's called, sees a nice 3% performance increase while depth of field is on screen, and the visual difference is a slight bit of instability in the circular depth of field, like you can see here. So I recommend that quarter option without denoising for my recommended settings. After this, recommended settings are mostly about preserving visual detail, and we can see that with instance quality, and this will affect the density of vegetation like grass. And it noticeably reduces the amount of vegetation close to the camera even on medium settings, with a lackluster 2.5% performance increase in this scene here. In my opinion, this is too much of a loss for the visuals for the performance gained, so I recommend high for my optimized settings. I feel similarly about the model quality setting. Here, going down to medium will noticeably increase pop-in, and you'll see a reduction of quality at a distance for models. Like here, check out the boulder and the base of the tree. They're rather noticeably degraded at medium and lower. The uptick in performance is somewhat hard to ignore with that 6% better performance at medium. So I will say use high as a base for most GPUs, but if you find yourself dropping frames in a way that you're not happy with, well then, go down to medium. The other settings in the menu are nice to see and perhaps are great for scaling down to the ultra low end, like 10-year-old GPUs for example, but in my experience here, scaling is limited for modern hardware. For example, that detail setting. In my experience, you may see minor reductions in draw detail at a distance with it being turned down, but really only very minor increases in performance, best left at the highest quality. Same with cloud quality. You can see this technically affecting the quality of clouds, making them less accurately rendered, so they become more diffuse, but getting those clouds to be visible in normal game camera angles is going to be very rare. And even then, the performance increase while they are on screen, as we see here, is not exactly large. So once again, unless there's a late game moment here where you dance in the clouds or something, I would keep this one just at ultra. Beyond this, there are two other settings that I think require mentioning. First is animation quality, and I really couldn't find a meaningful visual difference when looking for it. Perhaps this affects some areas of the game I could not find, or it is a small difference. Either way, when GPU limited, there was no performance difference at all. When CPU limited, at a much lower resolution, I did measure a few percentage better performance at the lower settings. So if it is working, then it is doing something, but that performance increase I did measure is not exactly great. So I would just keep this one at high. Other than that, there's the slow HDD streaming option. Now, usually I would just ignore this, as you shouldn't really be gaming off an HDD in the year 2023, but I was intrigued by its description text, where it says that it's front-loading more of the game's assets into system memory and VRAM to reduce streaming. Regardless of having a hard drive, this option actually makes a lot of sense on PC. Forget not, PCs are different than consoles, where there's a minimal shared pool of RAM that needs constant paging to the disk on console. On PC, you can potentially have a lot more VRAM and system RAM to be streaming from instead of from the disk. So if you can reduce the amount of streaming from the disk by preloading it more, that makes a lot of sense for PC-based design. Sadly, I couldn't find any positive behavior while turning this on while using an SSD. There was potentially a small amount of more VRAM or system RAM being used while running around in this coastside town here, but the effect on performance was invisible over the average run. Both runs of the game with the option on or off were within margin of error of one another. So this idea on paper sounds nice, and it is a way I would like to see PCs being used in the future as more system and VRAM becomes available, but in the meantime, this is a niche option with little benefit if your PC is using an SSD, as it really should be. Lastly, you have texture quality, and like I just mentioned at the beginning of this optimized settings segment, I see little reason for anyone with a decently modern GPU to worry about this setting. Perhaps if you have 4 GB or less VRAM on your GPU, you could consider medium texture quality, but if you have 6 or above, you're going to be fine at ultra at high resolutions with no issues. And with that being said, we have our optimized settings. It's mostly high or ultra here since the game is so light in general, but with a few tweaks. And there's also that model quality setting, which I recommend to be at high, but if you're unhappy with your performance, then drop that down to medium for a potentially good win. When using my optimized settings in an average scene like this one here, you can see around a nice 20% average performance increase, which is nice indeed to see for such a little visual difference. Getting to the end of the video here, I will conclude by saying Baldur's Gate 3 is a great game on PC, and unlike many PC releases as of late, it does have very few issues. It is polished, and I think it almost shames the technical quality of other big AAA releases I have seen. I wish it did a few things better, like having FSR 2 at launch. And as I showed off in the API segment, Vulkan is a bit of a question mark here, and there can technically be some less than awesome frame times when running around the NPC populated areas like we can see here on a Ryzen 5 3600, where the frame times there, while CPU limited, show the game having issues. If possible, I would love to see such NPC-laden moments of the game have better frame time stability even on mid-range older CPUs. But other than those few aspects, I will say Larian has done a darn good job here. If you did like this video, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. If you're already a subscriber, hit that little bell in the corner to be informed as soon as Digital Foundry posts a video. Other than that, support us on Patreon to get years worth of our content in high quality for download. Comment below, follow on Twitter, and as always, this is Alex bidding you farewell und auf Wiedersehen.